Okay, we're on live, and I'm about to do the Tunnel of Eternity stream share to get the RJ's Evolution Hour up here. Thanks for instructing this. That's actually, as you well know, part of a little video that has a music, but unfortunately we can't seem to get that to not cause audio problems. So we just do it what we can while we can. That would be our opening segment. And let me also then put up this cute little puppy. Show and tell of what I just Googled about image of human evolution. And I call attention to the chimpanzee that is not represented by a fossil, and the little green dot that represents the early hominoids, and then the little red one that refers to the Australopithecines, which we know all by fossils again, all of these. And then this little bunch here, which is Homo habilis, the tool maker, Homo erectus, which spread out all over Eurasia, and then our bunch, all guys. Heck, we don't get to get women in there apparently, but there takes two to tango. This was just an example, and you can see across the top of the screen many of the images that pop up, including junk from our little pals at the Chick Big Daddy pamphlet. I think that was up here somewhere or other. It gets popped up in a lot of different contexts. Anyway, I'll just, for your edification and delight, and then get back to the exciting world of the discussion at hand. This actually came from a viewer suggestion, actually a couple viewer suggestions when I was fielding things. Several people on Twitter wanted to have human evolution as a topic. One particularly on the idea that is human evolution going on now? And the short answer is yup. And I'll be alluding to some of that stuff. But also another was more interested in the deep time aspects, which is why I put up that fossil representation here. I put up a link also to my paper that I did as part of the TIP project, Planet of the Apes, which is, although 13 years old now, still holds up, I think, quite nicely. The big picture has still the same. Our species originated in Africa. That came from pretty much the bunch of Homo erectus and the gang. That comes from Homo habilis and the gang, from Australopithecines and the gang. And farther on back, we now have a lot more blips on the scope to both muddy up and complexify that transitional process, where we can see that there were a lot of hominids that coexisted, there were a lot of ecological variations. There's a lot to put in, but the big picture thing is still the same. The overall trend of it, trend line is the same. So we got a look over here before we get started. I see Psy Strikes in the field. Hi, and Paranor, and Psy just tweeted the shows out. Beach points out that our jaws are smaller, teeth crowned, some not even getting wisdom teeth now. Yeah, there's a whole paleoanthropology thing about the development of how our particularly distinctive jaw shape and tooth distribution has occurred. I could have absolutely inundated people with technical references on any one of these subjects in the notes to this video, but boy, we don't live in an area where we can put hyperlinks up, or at least I don't know how to do that yet. And but I did suffice with just some general papers that are all public access, where you can look them up yourself and follow up on things relating to some human issues and also the genetic issues. The big picture point about human evolution is that we're not out of sight of nature. The same principles that are guiding the evolution of trilobites back 200, 300, 400 million years ago, and are affecting the evolution of whales or the origin of birds and mammals, any of these things are exactly the same processes that we can see today. And it's all bloody microevolutionary. Little tiny gene shifts here and there, and a little bit here that gets into a lineage. And then over time, it may or may not have an effect, but it can end up having a larger effect. And there was a thing, I will go back to the exciting world of screen sharing, to put up this little bit. I put a link to the paper. It was a lecture by I think a grad student at University of Pittsburgh, and it's on a particular technical paper, which unfortunately wasn't open access, but I put a link to it. It's from Nature, and her lecture is in 2016. What you're looking at is the analysis of the various haplotypes of human beings. And what they were looking at was Tibetans and their ability to survive at high altitude and the kind of mutations. There's other technical papers I could have put in blips on about more about the exact genetics that they've been working out. But the Tibetans, which are this little purple blob down in here and also over here, um, turn out to have some aspects in their genomes that have affected this that have come from the Denisovans, which are that cute little bunch of early humans that have shown up in the fossil record along with Homo naledi and all of these others that have complicated the picture of things. Fortunately, with the Denisovans and also with Neanderthals, we've actually got the DNA to look at. So that's why you can do this. Now, you'll notice all the rest of this stuff pile up. These are all these different haplotype groupings from various bits, and you can look at the Finland and look up the technical papers to find out all the fiddly bit details on that. But each one of them are looking at this particular genetic haplotype and how it compares or not to other human beings within our species. And we can see that they've drawn upon some of the genetic baggage that apparently was contributed by this Denisovan branch. And we see that also with Neanderthals. I could have put up some papers on the recent material there where there's quite a few genes, something like 2 to 4% of Europeans and Eurasians have this DNA from our rare interbreedings with Neanderthals. Probably only a few hundred examples ever popped up, but it was enough to produce an active interaction. And what that means is, if you want to talk about human evolution, you have to look about the whole package of our DNA and all the bits and pieces of it and how it works out into the biology, how it works out into how the effects connect up on protein levels, on cis-regulatory levels. It's a lot of stuff. And it's important to note that the only people doing work in this area are evolutionists. Anti-evolutionists are interlopers at best. They make carpet bits, but that's about all it is. If you're looking in the side stream over in here, one of the questions that popped up was about, from a hard target, asking about the grasp reflex in apes and primates and how anti-evolutionists deal with it, if any. And that was actually a rather interesting subject that I had a little bit of information on. I put up a linkage or a reference to a 2010 paper from Almeida. I've obviously slaughtered the name because it's Spanish and I haven't bothered about how it was pronounced, but he's done quite a few technical papers. And if you look in my bibliography, you can find quite a lot on that. And one example that I could find of a creationist who bumped into that material, Elizabeth Mitchell, the ubiquitous Elizabeth Mitchell. She's one of the heavy hitters at Answers in Genesis who takes side swipes at the current technical literature. And I mentioned her a bit in Evolution Slam Dunk, and she pops up mainly in the newer material because she's been fairly recent on the field. And it's a marvelous example of data parsing, that you can pirouette and cycle and maneuver around sinuously the data stream. But if you read not merely both of the papers that she actually cited in her thing, if you actually go and read those and pay attention to the stuff, you can see the bigger picture that isn't getting on the field, let alone trying to figure out whether or not the data that they're seeing makes any sense within a creationist context. Looking down the feed here to see what we got in here. Any other questions? Beej asked, is there any other unknown group that has contributed to Melanesians? That one I'd have to defer to a lot of the technical material that I can't quite recall blip right offhand. As I recall, the Denisovans and that little bit of Neanderthal DNA, but I believe it was more the Denisovans, popped up curiously in blocks of Melanesians. But remember that the Melanesians came from the Asiatic mainland. So what you end up with are little blobs of population that pick up on the particular population subdemes and avatars. There's a bunch of technical terms that pop up in modern genetics on the subject. And it reminds us that we should all be proud that we're mongrels, that almost everybody isn't a purebred anything, that we've all worked off of the ancestral interplay of things, which have been accelerated genetically in recent times, where we started having trains and cars and airplanes where people could actually fall in love with people that lived like 100 miles away or more, which so that genetically started having impact on the population really in the 19th century, when you had the rise of railroads. In the old days, if you had conducted genetic studies, they didn't know how to do that. But if you did have that, you would see how relatively monotonous a lot of the genes were. But that means that all you needed was the occasional visitor from afar coming along, whether it's a crusader boinking somebody in the Middle East, or somebody coming in as a slave, in the case of American population or others, that enters into the field, that puts the genetic mix in, it changes the haplotype distributions, and to this day, they can take people's DNA. That Finding Your Roots series, it's on PBS, is a fine example of where sometimes it's surprising what pops up in people's genetic baggage, but the haplotypes are there, like little cue cards that tell us what's going on. I brought up a particular paper on recent human evolution relating to ALUs, our cute little retrotransposons that I love mentioning. Everybody should remember that about 10% of our genome is just the ALU retrotransposon, which is a relatively short string of presumably RNA viral introduced DNA that popped up. It's got a cousin over in the mouse side. I allude to it a little bit in Evolution Slam Dunk, and there's some technical work on both sides of the fence. But the version that we have is essentially a primate model, the ALU. And it's a retrotransposon, which means it says it's got a copy me signal in it. So basically, once it's in there, it gets copy me, copy me, copy me. And because of the cellular recombination and things that go on in natural biological processes, it pops up all over the place. And it ends up now, we've got over 1 million copies of it in our genome, and it's increasing, I think a couple hundred every generation, something like that. It usually doesn't do anything because it doesn't have a README code in it, but that can have a single point mutation, can switch the front end of it to say README, and that means it becomes functional, or rather would become functional depending upon where it is in the genome. And usually this is a problem because it gums up protein shapes and all that kind of stuff, and so you end up with quite a few diseases that are caused by ALUs kicking on. But this paper that I linked to was kind of alluding to the early stages of work in the area, but there are examples of where ALUs have become dynamic features of our brain. I think I've alluded to this in other videos as well. And so some of our human or primate brain evolution has come about as a consequence of dealing with all of these little fun and games that's going on, in part because of this ALU retrotransposon. Now, for the creationist, when you say, is human evolution going on, they want to see a monkey in the zoo turn into Philip Johnson all in one go, or to see a dog turning into a cat right in front of you in the laboratory. But that's exactly what evolution says never happens. All evolution is microevolutionary. And so you get tiny incremental changes in populations over time, to where only after you've seen how it's worked out over a long time do you realize, oh, wait a minute, that actually caused something new to happen. And we can look at the new and look back at the genetics to find out what was the natural causation of this and how things have worked out. So if you're looking about human evolution, the stuff that you can see on the fly are things like the adaptation to high altitude, which includes not just the Tibetans, but Andeans. And on the other side, we've got things, I didn't put papers up on this, but you could probably hunt around and look for them. The propensity to drink milk. It's no coincidence that the milk cow bit and all the cheeses and stuff that generate from it, in other words, lactose not intolerant, comes up in populations that happen to have carried up a variety of genes that have made them lactose tolerant, to where they can drink cow's milk without a problem. But a lot of people can't. And so you can differentiate between the problems that people will have carrying the genetic baggage of those that still retain the lactose intolerant element, as opposed to the ones that have gotten the switches genes and they're able to deal with it. All of that is evolution in action. It doesn't mean that human beings are going to turn into something with a sixth finger, or that we're going to grow pointy ears, or that we're going to turn into anything particular, because evolution can't anticipate that. But what you can say is absolutely everything that will occur to the human species from now down to the end of our extinction, assuming that happens sooner or later, probably will all be due to natural variations that we're seeing in the population, natural mutations, unless we begin to tinker with our genome directly by genetic engineering, in which case you've disconnected the evolutionary process in a sense, and now produced artificial selection rather than natural selection. And that's probably a subject for a whole new show, and why that's probably not necessarily a really good idea to do. Let me now look through. Heavy Holler made a joke. Yeah, oh, not Philip Johnson. Yeah, I had to mention him. For those of you who don't know who Philip Johnson is, he's the avatar of the intelligent design movement. Darwin's Black Box and all of that. I rip a lot of his crap to shreds in the TIP project in a lot of chapters. He is a very bright guy, got into Harvard when he was 16, so he had to stoop. But when you look at him at the source methods level and what he's relying on and what he isn't, he's a credulous git. He's just as prone to citing secondary scholarship and not really bothering to understand it, even though he's a bright guy, as a Ken Ham. And for somebody who has the kind of credentials that he does, it's really inexcusable. I mean, Ken Ham is a dunce. So are you surprised that he acts like one? But Philip Johnson should know better. And so there you see that ideology, the desire not to allow human evolution to be true, and then the willingness to scavenge around for whatever information you can get on it, really becomes paramount. The human evolution section in Philip Johnson's book I went through in great detail in the Planet of the Apes chapter, which I put a link to up on there. But I also went through a lot of his stuff, the chapter on fossils, dem bones, and also, of course, in the new Evolution Slam Dunk book, I reprised a lot of the material there. Brian asks, and so you don't think the antibacterials in the milk are connected to the lactose intolerant factor? It may have an effect on some populations currently, but remember, there were no unless they're occurring naturally. Anything that you put into milk, like the fact that we pasteurize milk nowadays, and that certainly ended the problem of people dropping dead from tainted milk, which was the reason why they had to start doing that. Homogenization of milk, a lot of these other factors. I grew up on just the kind of pasteurized milk, and apparently I'm not lactose intolerant, and I do love my cheeses. There may be epidemiological things on whether or not some of that affects certain people. We now know that there's an awful lot more to biology and epidemiology than was the case before. Look at the fact that they tended to do studies on men instead of women, forgetting that the female metabolism is not absolutely identical. They're different hormone balances. Another thing is when they would be doing stuff with adults and extrapolating it to children who have a different dynamic relationship, because some of the systems haven't kicked in and they have a different proportion in terms of how things can affect the biology. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me, but I don't have any direct information on that. Steve says, RJ, it's pre-pasteurization. Yeah, I have nothing. I have no knowledge on that subject, so I will not shoot my mouth off on it, because I don't know the details of it, all other than the fact that I'm coming from the wonderful world of pasteurization, and that it did in fact end a terrible problem. This was really in the 1890s on. It's another reason why you get into that with beer. There was an extent to which there was a problem about beers that weren't brewed at high enough temperature to deal with things. And you still have the problem over pork and the extent to which cultures reject that. And you need to cook your pork well. But I like pork. In fact, it's one of my favorite meats. And at the moment, it's significantly cheaper than chicken. You got to take out a bank loan for chicken these days. It's almost as expensive as steaks, which is way up on the food chain there. In addition to all the ecological considerations about how much feed is required for them, and there's a whole brouhaha over that, and that's a subject for another show. But I'm an omnivore and proud of it. The charts that I'd put up earlier, I think, give you some flavor both of the fossil data that's out there. I could have put up charts that indicated even more of the fossils, and whoa, that we can see that and I mentioned this in the old Planet of the Apes chapter, the idea of the single species model was a very common one through most of the 20th century, and it really only started to fade away in the late 20th century as it began to dawn on them that there was absolutely nothing in principle to suggest that multiple hominid species couldn't coexist, especially if they were in different ecological niches. I think the discovery of the robust Australopithecines really kind of put that into perspective, because there's two big groups in the Australopithecines: the glacial ones that are relatively slim, Lucy the Australopithecine, the ones that are on our line, Afarensis and all that, are to be there. And then there are the robust ones. I can't remember the species name on that one, but that have much stouter jaws, stronger skeletal muscles for these. So they apparently ate rougher things and stuff they had to chomp down on that required a bit more kunk to their eating. And they're very distinctive. And they were coexisting because they had different niches and the different ecological contexts. And then when they discovered the degree to which maybe some of the Homo erectus has survived much later, and of course we coexisted with the Neanderthals for an awful long time. We were latecomers on the field, but once we eventually outlived them. And because there were no other species of humans surviving except in maybe myths, where maybe some of these wild men of the woods may actually reflect some interactions with some of these remnant Homo erectus and other populations. We can't be absolutely certain of it because you can't tell, although in the case of the little Floresiensis ones that survived down to what, like 25,000 years or so ago, they're overlapping in the human species. And some of that may affect some of the mythological elements. But other than that, we just had our species. And so we began to think we were it. And it's kind of come as a shock to our egocentrism that before our species got to be top dog, we were just one among many dogs. And there was a huge range of things. And there was a huge debate between the out-of-Africa model and the multi-regional model. Wolpoff represented multi-regionalism, and Stringer and various others would be ones representing the out-of-Africa model. And they were always regarded as mutually exclusive, although as we got more and more into the genetics and more into the populations and the fossils that kept coming up, it looked like, and it's turned out, that it's kind of both. That yes, you have waves of populations moving out of Africa over time that swing through the various populations things, but you also have genetic flow between subpopulations in that vast processes, which is why we have Denisovans, and it's why we've got, probably because of why we have Neanderthals and these various other subgroups. The one thing that I was pointing out in the old book that still is true, that if you're looking at the transition zone between one stable form and the next, what you're going to find are squishy zones where it's really hard to figure out where they fit in. They're almost this, but yet they're almost that. That's why to this day, the divide between the Australopithecines and Homo habilis, the first of our genus, is Homo habilis the first Homo genus, or is it just the most advanced of the Australopithecines and you decide to label it the other thing? And that's a problem that I pointed out before in terms of systematics, is that by definition, they have to pigeonhole one or the other. It can't be an in-between. There's no room in Linnaean taxonomy, or for that matter, cladistic taxonomy, for an in the middle, an almost. Although the numerical cladistic techniques can actually analyze stuff, and you just basically call them sister groups. But creationists and people who kind of think in the seat of the pants sort of a thing want there to be an abrupt a graded transition without there being a graded transition, and they never think about what the graded transition would be. And so when they look at things, they can't really put the pieces together and look at it. So when anybody wants to be discussing human evolution with a creationist, you got to kind of peel away their mythologies and their misunderstandings. They're not going to really understand speciation. They probably will have never looked at any of the technical work. And if you're going to get serious about discussing it with them, you're going to have to be a little bit familiar with the names as well. The rule should be that if you see somebody post a chart on the internet, tweet, for example, if you can kind of identify a lot of them just by sight, or if you see the name, you immediately think about what that animal looked like, and you can have a sense of the temporal range, then you're on top of the data. If you're looking at things and they just look like skulls, you probably are a little too far away from the data, and you would venture into this field with a creationist at your own risk, because you may stumble into things and make statements which can come back and bite you. So it's always a matter of wanting to be as expert as possible. Looking over the comments in here, Fino says most people don't prefer unhomogenized milk as it can feel buttery to the tongue. Yeah, I imagine to some extent it relates to our whole taste systems. Most of what we call flavoring, though, comes actually from how it smells. But we do have different taste elements in the different fields of things. One of the reasons why people trying to produce candies or various products that aren't really made of the stuff they are trying to imitate have to find it so difficult in the chemistry department to figure out why is it that the stuff that we like tastes the way it does. What are the actual biological features? What are the genetic developmental elements that produce the things that make us feel the way we do and make the stuff that we want to eat taste the way it does? And there's a whole gigantic field in that area, and it's gotten much more precise now that we know more about the genotyping and all that. So there's actually a lot of technical literature that sort of pops up in the context of industry work that's wanting to figure out why certain things work the way they do and why our taste buds work the way they do, because there's money to be made in figuring out how to trick it with something that costs less to do but will have the same effect as the, air quotes, real thing. Yes, Beach, is probably the same way I feel about eggnog now. Yes, yes. You either are pro-eggnog or anti-eggnog now that we're going into the holidays or the Christmas season. Merry Christmas, everyone, now that the emperor has decreed that we can say that. Gosh, I was saying that all along. But anyway, fruitcake and various other things that people either love or hate. Yeah, I've never been a great eggnog fan, so yeah. Unless you dump a lot of rum in it, then I can tolerate the eggnog. But then again, you know, that's me. Any responses so far? I'm about halfway through. While I wait for some discussions going on here, I think I will put up my pathetic, shameless plug. We'll go for screen share. Yay! And here's a nod to my patrons on the Patreon. There's the website on there. I put the links to all of this stuff up in the description. And you can also find all of that at the world famous, or isn't, www.tortucan.wordpress.com. Steve and John and Dyer and Eat and Mona and Jen and Jody and Staggles and Totes Real and Paul on the patrons. I can sure use a lot more patrons. I can sure use a lot more at the GoFundMe site. I can sure use more people getting either of my books, and you can find links to those. You want to have conniption fits with creationists, start talking the reptile-mammal transition to them after you've read Evolution Slam Dunk. I think we've got that covered. I'll keep this up a tad bit longer. So any questions on the show so far, or comments, or things to continue to discuss? Fire away, gang, because we're about halfway through. I hope everybody will be exploring the links that I put up. They are technical papers, and because they're open access, you can download them as a PDF or look at them in an HTML, however you want to feel with it. In the case of PNAS, Proceedings in the National Academy of Sciences, you also have the advantage of being able to look down at the bottom of the paper in HTML format, either in an abstract or in the full text, and it'll give you a lot of the technical papers that have cited it within that high-wire system. And that can give you a feel about how important the work is. If it's been cited a little bit, or mainly by the same author, that's one measure. If it's got a line as long as your arm of papers that have signed it, and it's just exploded new work and so forth and so on, that's giving you a different dynamic on it. So that's a handy thing about PNAS, and it is, after all, stuff that's done at our money has gone for this. It's the National Academy of Sciences. It's an absolutely fabulous resource. All papers in there are open access freebie. after a year, and a lot of papers pop up open access even on original publication. You always look down to look for the little orange whoop open access thing, and my smiley face goes on when I find those for my tip research, because it means I get it full text right away and I can save the PDF and all that, and it makes nice. But as I've been browbeating on this methods approach by now, and if you haven't imbibed it, take the plunge. There's nothing like being able to read the primary source, be able to read the full material. And when you read a technical paper, if you're not into the science directly, it'll give you a measure of how not into it you are or not. If you can look at a technical paper and you can follow along what's being said, it won't necessarily mean you'll know every little in and out, but you'll have a general feel for it. We could even do a tutorial on that sometime in an evolution hour if somebody wants to be interested in that kind of a thing of don't be afraid of a science paper. It's not rocket science. It's not magic. In the same way, don't be afraid of a legal paper. No, there's no discipline on earth that's magic. It's a set of principles. It's a set of terminology that they use. It's a set of buzzwords. It's a set of formats that will vary from one discipline to another. The way they reference technical works in some fields is different than others. There's no universal toolkit going on. But the overall methodology of it is interchangeable. And people present what their argument is, and they have standards of evidence. There's peer review. That you don't find that, of course, in legal work. It's a different dynamic over in there. But in the science field, you do. And once you get used to that, then you can navigate around and you can put up in your own mind, you can put up your own little question mark zones where you're going down through a paper. And I do it all the time with myself. I'm going, what the hell does that mean? And if you then may have to look up the terminology and you find out, okay, because they're not going to explain it in the paper, they're writing for a technical audience. But you can Google it, you can find out and go, oh, that's what it's talking about. And the stupid technical name, you'll find in a lot of technical papers, they'll be talking about taxa, Gigapopus with the Latin name. They will not say what the hell it is. And so you often have to Google it. I do. To where, oh, that's a plant. Okay, now I know what they're talking about. That's a moss. Oh, this is a particular rodent. Because they literally will not bother putting that information in. They often don't put chronology into a lot of paleontology papers. You have to, they may mention the period it's in, but they don't usually put a nice convenient little chart up most of the time to put you into perspective. They should probably, as a handy bit for it, or at least make that easily available for lay people that are reading it. But that's not the world we live in, so you work around it. So let's look over in the side area there. Fino said, James, do you see the bar with the buttons? There's a frame around the chosen frame of the fonts. Directly left of that is reverted P for the paragraph signs. Press that button. And oh boy, we're going to have to go through that later. Not while I'm live. My brain will fart. Heavy Aller asks, have any creation scientists actually studied hominid fossils, or do they just take established papers and put their own mangled spin on them? Oh, that's an easy one. No, none of them study hominid fossils directly. There's not a single working creationist paleontologist who does that at all. Zero, zip, nada. You do find a few creationists with paleontology degrees. A couple of young Earth creationists, Marcus Ross and Kurt Wise, obviously. To some extent, Leonard Brand and a few others do paleontological work, and they get published in real paleontology journals every once in a while, kind of peripherally. And then, of course, over in ID land, there's Beckley, who's just popped up, but he's an insect paleontologist and systematist. So there's zip none. Now, all of the material that you'll find online, whether it's intelligent design or old Earth creationist or young Earth creationist that's on human evolution issues, is all secondary from people who are not paleontologists. They're looking at it from afar. And the main rule is, since they're all religiously oriented, they don't want humans to have evolved from anything. They've got to be a separate species. Even if they don't mention kinds, which you won't get into in intelligent design work, that's really what it matters. They're okay with trilobites maybe speciating, but not humans. So you get the dig in the heel part. And the amazing thing is how little of systematics is done on any human issue. It's a whole parade of evasion. I tried to get into some of that with Planet of the Apes in the old tip book, and it's only gotten worse since. But it's the same principle. There's an awful lot of authority quoting. There's an awful lot of hide the balling where they don't really tell you what they think happened. Okay, you don't like Australopithecines? What the hell do you think was going on over those for those millions of years down there? What about those funky little hominids? Once we get into our Homo genus, they're making tools. And in fact, we now have indication that some of the Australopithecines were making extremely primitive tools too. And as I go into in some length in Planet of the Apes, it matters that we can see non-humans making wood stone tools. Because in order to make some of these hand axes, you have to really have a very sophisticated mind. And so even though we don't have an Australopithecine there to put under an MRI, the fact that tools exist, or in the case of Homo erectus, the more sophisticated stuff, when you try to replicate the tool, we know what thought processes you have to go into to do that. And that's a fascinating field. Toth and various others have done work on that, and I allude to it in Planet of the Apes, that literally just are off the scope. Anti-evolutionists of all stripes just don't pay any attention to that stuff. And well, they mustn't, because it would mean getting into the mind of an extinct animal that's not a human, and yet it's doing stuff that require it to be transitional to what we now regard as human, the ability to conceptualize things, to envisage, just like when Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo in particular would envisage what the statue looks like in the stone. You have to do that when you make a hand axe. When you want to make flint tools, you have to sense about what the block is and where to go, boop, to be able to hit it, to fission off the obsidian, to make the right kind of a thing. And that you only discover that if you try to replicate it. And the ones who replicate it are never anti-evolutionists. They don't do any of that. So let's see what else we got down in our little question zones. If someday, Pheno says, would all have to be almost back to Nathstostomata to affect both lizards and us, though. Yeah, that's a good question of how far back the baggage goes. A lot of the things in our language genes, for example, FOXP2, is at least going back through the mammal lineage. A lot of the things about, well, I'll tell you one thing that has a really deep root. This stuff here, the hair, boop, boop. The bone morphological protein and the Sonic Hedgehog gene, yes, Sonic Hedgehog, named for the cartoon character, or the video game character, and the keratin components and all of that are things that go way back into the basal amniotes in terms of the superstructure. And those have been playing out with various mutations along various lines, and I cited a lot of that in Slam Dunk on the newer work on that. Alibardi and all the rest, in addition to Prum and Brush and all that, that are really deep roots about why the same genetic systems have mutated along their lineages in birds to make feathers, and in our synapsid line to make us into furballs. And so there's an example of something that's very, very deep. Some of the things involving individual genetic systems, Preston genes, and a lot of the other things have really deep roots. Some of them are apparently Precambrian. So yeah, there's a lot of deep, deep, deep baggage that goes on. It depends on the genes. Let's see. Pheno says, well, G-Man thinks dogs aren't eukaryotes, though that simply means having cells with nuclei and all those nifty organelles. Well, remember, G-Man is not a credit to his phylum. So for those who know G-Man, he is this extremely truculent ignoramus creationist who pops up occasionally on some of the great debate community things. And next to Edgar, Mr. Intelligent Design, he's less amiable than Edgar, but just as obtuse. Let's see what else we. Beach says, heard about one denying being a biped. Yeah, the old, I can't remember whether it was Plato or Aristotle that describe humans as featherless bipeds. And it's true, but not necessarily terribly informative. It is a revealing thing about the fact that we are a biped. Bipedality is not that common an adaptation. We heard kind of commonly amongst a lot of the hominids, which means there's things about genetics, there's things about the balance. Some of the bipedality that's showing up are in arboreal creatures. Lord Crocker Squirrel says G-Man isn't a credit to breathing in and out. Yeah, that's probably true too. Yeah. But the bipedality thing involves balance, and it involves adaptations, and even some arboreal creatures in that ape line that's producing that shrubbery from which the hominids developed that we see with Australopithecines way later on. And we're talking 10, 20, 30 million year time frame going on here. It's quite a long haul. That's still an unusual adaptation for mammals. I think I mentioned in one of my old book chapters about the little teeter-totter mouse-like thing, rabbit-sized critter, I think it was, that had a long balancing tail and a long neck and grasping arms, and it's in the mesal formation. So that would be, what, 50 million years ago or so. And that's an unusual one. Kangaroos are another bipedal form. So it's not at all common for mammals. By contrast, birds are 100% bipedal, and it's because they had picked it up from their dinosaur ancestors that had developed bipedality, and all the balancing systems were needed to do that way before you ever get things that's got feathers or go flap flap. Pheno was, he was so proud to own a real eagle feather as a preteen. I definitely do not agree with the featherless. Well, we can adorn ourselves with feathers, but we are as yet on a distinct lineage in terms of that feather thing. There's been so much work on that, and I alluded to a lot of that material in Slam Dunk on the evolution of feathers and skin plaque codes in basal amniotes and all of that. The field is very, very interesting, and creationists pay virtually no attention to it. Then we got Lord Crocosquirrel says 30 million years went on in 30 minutes if you take Kent Hovind at face value. Yeah, well, they don't think that far. Kent Hovind being a young Earth creationist, all young Earth creationists functionally have a really abrupt time frame on things. Everything was created 6,000 years ago, but all the stuff you can see as fossils for all practical purposes are generated from the flood, which was only about 4,500 years ago. And somehow or other, the people building the pyramids in Egypt didn't notice any of this. Oops. And they have to functionally truncate not tens of millions of years, but hundreds of millions of years for all practical purposes. All the stuff from the Cambrian and the Devonian and the Silurian and the entire Mesozoic period and the Eocene and the Paleo, all of that stuff, every fossil thing has to be scrunched together as all part of one gigantic flood glop. And it's just way too ridiculous to be able to pull that kind of stuff together. I used an analogy in the Dinomania chapter, and there again, yes, you can find that at tip. Dinomania is explicitly on the young Earth creationists, and Dinomania because of dinosaurs. Young Earth creationists are the only anti-evolutionists who kind of sort of talk about dinosaurs a teeny bit. Intelligent designers don't pay any attention to it at all. But in there, I made an analogy about the sequential nature of things and how, coming at it as a historian, things can't make sense if they happen too quickly. The same reason that you can't bake a cake if you just try to speed things up. And I gave the example of the piece of real estate at 5th Avenue and 42nd Street in New York City. It's the place where the Empire State Building is now, but that isn't what was always there. Before the Empire State Building, it was the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, not the current one. That moved uptown. And this old one was there from the 1890s on, and it was built in segments. And farther back, it didn't used to be the Waldorf Astoria. It was just the Waldorf, because the house next door was Caroline Astor's mansion. And in fact, the reason why there was a Waldorf hotel there is when William Waldorf died, one of the Astors died, and William Waldorf took over the place. And he hated his aunt so much that he tore his mansion down, the family house, and put a hotel up next door to her just to snub her. And she stuck it out there for like 10, 20 years. My gosh, she was... well, no, I don't even think it was that long. I think it was a fairly short amount of time that she finally got fed up, and she built a new mansion. I think she lived into the early 20th century. So they decided to build another hotel. The other half of the hotel, the Astoria part. They were originally going to call it after, she wanted to have it named after her side of the family, so it was going to be the Waldorf Schermerhorn, or Skimmerhorn, but they talked her out of that one and turned it into the Waldorf Astoria. So what we got is, imagine if all that stuff took place at the same time. So I put an envisage up of Mrs. Astor in her ballroom entertaining the 400. but trying to keep out of the way of all of the people coming in to register at the lobby of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And then they're suddenly shocked when they hear this terrible sound as the B-24 slams into the Empire State Building in 1945 and debris rains down outside. No, this stuff didn't all happen at once. And any attempt to kind of truncate a sequence together that way is going to produce chaos. And it's no coincidence that you can never find any creationist, including all the way up at the top of the food chain, like Andrew Sneller, try to put together what the hell they think happened with this data. Now, that would apply just as much to the hominid record and the fossil data about human beings, because you've got all of these fossil data. Why is it that where were the Australopithecines on the ark? They're animals. What kind were they? Wouldn't they have had to have been on the ark? Where did they go afterwards? Why don't we find any record of them? Where is Homo habilis? What are these? And they don't really want to think a hell of a lot on that, although the one baraminology study that was done by, I think, Todd Wood, hilariously, by his own measurements, ended up putting one of the Australopithecines in the human kind. And at which point your mouth drops and go, do you really want to be sure that your method is all that clever? Because you've just managed to link up, they skipped right over the Homo erectus and managed to put one of the Australopithecines, probably because he was dealing with just tiny selected little bits and pieces of information. As I've seen already in other baraminology studies, they flush a lot of data down the drain before they put it into their little mill. And I think this time he flushed a little too much down and ended up with a really weird conclusion. Let's see who else is going on in here. Something about subspecies Abrahamica. Of HIV, Hayef says, and yet creationists try to pretend that the 20 to 25 million years of the Cambrian explosion is sudden. Yeah, well, intelligent designers do that too. So intelligent designers like Steve Meyer are operating from the same chronological frame as regular science. They don't think the universe was only 6,000 years old. But they are facing the opposite problem there. They've got the whole shebang to contend with as a map of time problem, and then they have to look at the fiddly bit details. What we have with the supposed explosion, which I'm fair to call it that, because it is reasonable to argue that there was a proliferation, particularly of buggy things, arthropods, just a in the Cambrian, and a lot of them don't last all that long. They don't make it out of the Cambrian. A lot of them form totally extinct lineages. One of the little minor players on the scene were these little wiggly chordates that show up every once in a while in the fossils, and that's the groups, of course, that we came from. Vive la différence on these little minor groups. But not all of the phyla are appearing even in the limited data set that we have. Some of the stuff comes about the fact that you have to be able to have soft parts or preserve them in a very rare thing, and that's where that Lagerstätten term, and I will type that into the thing here. There should be a little umlaut on that. It's kind of like a mother lode thing, and the word pops up all the time in paleontology literature. So if you see that a deposit, that mesoll that I mentioned, the Solnhofen, where Archaeopteryx comes from, those are all Lagerstätten deposits. They're very unusual. There are 3 of them in the Cambrian, and I think I discussed a bit of that, I believe, in the stuff that I'd done previously on the Cambrian. The oldest one is from China, Shenzhen, and then there's the Sirius Passet up in Greenland, and then there's the Burgess Shale in British Columbia, all of which are northern hemisphere now, but they were equatorial on the northern coast of the breaking up Rodinia supercontinent. At the time, they were fresh turf. And it's looking pretty suspicious that you've got so many Lagerstätten spread out still over like 20 million years from that particular zone. And it suggests ocean chemistry is playing a role, that there's a particular balance of things that are taking place there that make these rare, but still a lot. 3 is quite a large number for Lagerstätten, when typically you don't find more than 1, and go 100 million years and you still don't find any. that there's something going on. The same way with the Ediacara biota and what few, the Doshento deposit and that in China also, that preserved little fossil embryo things, but only up to about 0.5 millimeter. I mentioned quite a bit of that in the old tip work, so this has been out for quite some time. But what was going on earlier, we don't have logger staking. So you can't pin down what little proto-trilobites and proto-chordates and proto-other arthropods are knocking around in there, other than inferentially, because you've got predator-prey relationships and complicated stuff that's going on that we can infer from the fact that, like, we've got little boreholes in things, so something is trying to eat something that's inside, but we don't know what the hell's inside the shell, and we don't know what the hell is trying to bore in because we don't have any logger staking. So this is a point I call the Bermuda Triangle defense. I did a video on that as well. Those of you who want to explore that a little bit more can go poke around in that. Oh, Fino, if you're going to tell me how to make things, Alt 132 on the keypad makes the beautiful umlaut. Oh, wow. Yipes. That's, let me test that out. Boop, 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 boop. And 132. So I don't think it's. Oh, by heavens, you're right. Ha ha. Thank you. Yeah. Yep. There you go. I made it. Yay. I probably won't do that again. But nevertheless, because my fingers have enough trouble to slow down and try to do things, there's a little bit of arthritis in my right hand and a little bit of dyslexia popping up where, and the fact that some of the images are rubbing off the keyboard, so I have to remember where they are. And so I and O look like a tiny little blurb on there. I can't see what they are, but I remember the I is on one side and the O's on the other, and occasionally my fingers back up and I type O instead of I, or vice versa. So I think umlauts are going to be the last on my list, Croco Squirrel, as to Orfino that's going to be in there. Yeah, it's in Windows Out 10. There's a lot of things that I still need to do on the techniques of things. Well, we're nearing the end of the hour on things. Again, I highly recommend poking around in some of the technical papers on there. Make comments as you will if you find new information, or if you are unimpressed with the papers I selected, or whatever. I can anticipate maybe a few creationists popping up. I've gotten some hilarious jousts with some people on some of the videos that I've done, of where it certainly shows that some people have way too much time on their hands, and they just go on and on and on obtusely, repeating the same thing over and over again. Just get a grip and move on. But my rule is, if you can't explain the data, why are you in this discussion? If you're not going to think about the data, if you're going to go off on a hobby horse, who cares? Life is short. Although I don't plan on giving them the last word on it particularly. I'll jump in on it to make a little comment on it, and hopefully use it as an opportunity to bring up some actual science information. The thing I will remind everybody is that we live in 2017, and there is no excuse whatsoever for being ignorant of the science data. This is not a time in the old days where it was hard to get stuff, that you would have to go to a college library and pore through stacks of old dusty things and copy things down by hand before photocopiers. You know, this is the old days. Photocopiers were like a miracle when I discovered those during my college years and made the most of it. Now we can get easily 80% of the relevant technical literature, and sometimes the entire books will pop up if you hunt around for them online in PDF formats. And so that there's a colossal amount of information that's available. Not everything, but a colossal amount. So that when you want to joust with anybody on any technical subject, you can find out a heck of a lot on things. Some of the ones, if they're in like papers like Science and Nature, you'll have to bear in mind that if it's a new paper, you're probably not going to be able to get it full text unless you pay through the paywall on it. But let it steep for a while, and the odds are that 4 or 5 years down the road, yeah, one of the authors will have posted it on Academia EDU, or it'll become available in other contexts. It'll become a lecture point, so they have the PDF up that way, and the thing breaks down. So the older the papers are, the better it is. And what's delightful from a scholarly point of view, going after creationists, is that a lot of the stuff they will be relying on is old stuff, and sometimes obscure stuff. One of the things that I found was so hilarious was one creation. It pops up every once in a while, and it's a human evolution issue, by the way, where it's from the Canadian Journal of Anthropology, and you see it popping up. Anybody who wants to Google it can look this little puppy up, and you'll hit a brick wall in a sense, because I don't think it's online anywhere. And it sounds kind of official, doesn't it? But I discovered, to my absolute delight, that Eastern Washington University, my alma mater, had, and it's not a journal at all. It's a mimeograph sheet from a bunch of Canadian creationists who apparently had their primary interest was disproving the idea that Columbus was all that important, because they were really big groupies of the Norse discovery of America, and they were having, that was one of their big hobby horse. But these were just yokels, and why it was even picked up at all, I have no clue. But anyway, I never dreamed I would be able to find this thing and actually locate that. So the Canadian Journal of Anthropology, not arthropology, my typo, anthropology, is a fake journal. It's not a journal. It's not even qualifies as an actual magazine. It was just the title they gave to this little mimeograph sheet that they put out for just a few years. It wasn't out very long, back I think in the 1970s and that. And it was just a delight to actually see it full text, to where I could actually write down the notes on these things and find out. But you still see it popping up to this day in creationist apologetics. It doesn't show up in intelligent design stuff typically. It's typically a creationist one, but it popped up, and now that I know the background of it, I can go, big mistake in citing that one. Hayab says, I just don't get why ID people feel it's reasonable to insert an unobserved designer tinkering with DNA for 3 billion years, which then apparently vanished when humans came along. They haven't thought it through that clearly. They have a designer. If you look at Michael Behe and the various other designers, design advocates, they are thinking in a very abstract way. The designer designs, the creator creates, but they don't really think through what a design event means. So at no point has Michael Behe sat down and thought through, okay, now if I were to go back in the time machine and look at the bacterial flagellum, I would have to go back this far, and I would be seeing this design event where this component is put in. But no. There's no point where any of them ever think in those terms. They think purely as abstractions, to where they feel they've identified that there must have been a designer because of irreducible complexity, because of complex specified complexity, because of fill in the blank. And that's as far as it goes. So there's a vagueness to intelligent design thinking that's just astonishing. And the moment you try to pin them down on what I call the map of time problem, what the hell do you think happened? You'll discover there's a fog bank there. And it's true for people at the top of the food chain. I don't think Michael Denton. Now, Denton is actually a very interesting example here, because Denton is not religious. He's apparently an agnostic. So he's coming at this design thing from a very abstract, vaguely typological point of view, to where evolutionists can't explain stuff, therefore it must be some kind of something or other. And he's very vague about what he thinks happened on that. That's a dead giveaway that you've got somebody that has an object of desire, or rather an object that they don't want to be true. And usually it's human beings mustn't have evolved, and therefore everything necessary to keep that insulated. But Denton is in a slightly different ballpark. That makes him fascinating to study, because you can see that at ground, even though he doesn't have a religious motivation, his bad method is exactly the same as what you see amongst creationists. Let's see what, Fino, when you are an ID proponent, a lab coat is making your stuff scientific. Well, let me cut them some slack. There are intelligent designers who have PhDs. They've been published in regular literature. They haven't exactly set the house on fire. Ann Gager and Douglas Axe and others, they're minor players on the field. Scott Minnick is a bacterial flagellum researcher at University of Idaho. But when you look at their model of things, of what they think happened, that's the step 3. Let me summarize here again the 4 ways that people can screw up. Number 1, overly reliant on secondary sources that they don't fact check. 2, limited data set from their fact claimants. That's where we're getting into the PhD ones. 3, inability to work out a map of time. for inability to conceptualize changing their mind. What evidence would do that? Those criteria. The first two are scholarly methods ones. The other two are cognitive. Everybody, whether or not they've got the lab coat or not, whatever their PhD is or not, at a methods level, they're not conceptualizing their own position. They may think they do, but they don't really think through what they think happened on that. And if you frame methods questions to identify that, you're going to start seeing the fog bank show up and the double standards. Michael Behe insists that evolutionists have to work the flagellum down to the bloody point mutation level of every single step in its generation before he can accept it as a natural phenomenon. But does he have to explain every single design event down to the last little tweak and twiddle? Oh, no, he doesn't have to think about that at all. He gets to pop the champagne cork without having to do the work. Nope, that doesn't come up. And the reason why I like to bring up the reptile-mammal transition is because it is the killer app here, because nobody in the anti-evolution business gets anywhere close to it. We're getting some stuff on origin of life here. Old scratch, 4.3 billion year old microbial fossils discovered in hydrothermal vents. I'm not sure about the 4.3 billion. I think some have gone back to 4 billion. What they're talking about is little bits and pieces of things that might be that. Some of it is also involving the trace element amounts that have different isotope relationships that are characteristic of life systems. And it's no big never mind to me at the moment whether or not life originated at 4 billion or 4.3. 4.3, though, is pushing it interestingly close to the last super bombardment that was vaporizing the oceans. And so it would be surprising that to see that life was terribly common at that point. But I'm not sure about that 4.3. Beej says, do they ever mention about life around hydrothermal vents? How did Noah save them? Well, because it's in the ocean, Beej. You don't have to save anything down there. They allow the fish to take care of themselves and the hydrothermal vents to take care of themselves. So they don't really think about that much. They mention, to some extent, you'll find a little bit of discussion of hydrothermal vent organisms, but it's in the gee whiz, ain't God clever for making this fabulous, amazing creature. And that's about as far as it goes. Most of the weird little critters that exist, particularly ones that leave very little fossil record and are very tiny and often parasitical, don't get a huge amount of coverage in any of the anti-evolution literature, independent of whether they're creationists or intelligent designers. Fino points out creationists to PhDs like Georgia Purdom that lets Ken Ham get away with inane crap. He wants to talk about evolution and never corrects him on genetics. Yeah, well, there you've got it. And the thing is that she has got an ideology that she's convinced that the young Earth creationism is true. And she is already pre-formatting her view of genetics to match up with the creationism. Ken Ham is farther down the data stream. So she's actually being seen as a core fact claimant. By the way, I pointed this out before, but I'll remind everybody in my tip work, and I could use support so I can keep doing this. There's only about 45 core fact claimants in all of anti-evolutionism currently. And 2/3 of them are the young Earth creationists, and the remaining third are intelligent designers. In other words, you could rent a room at a Holiday Inn, a meeting room, and have seats available to seat all of the fact claimants in anti-evolutionism. Everybody else is just a secondary redactor who filters that stuff at one way or another downstream. Fino says, and wasn't there quite a bit of disagreement on Andrew Snelling's work with geology, like him being denied that Grand Canyon license due to not being able to fill out a research proposal? Yeah, Snelling is a fascinating case. I did a little bit of a video on him earlier, and the case is probably, it hasn't reached adjudication yet, but Snelling has been a doctrinal young Earth creationist for a very long time. He still has published occasionally in regular geology journals. It's nice, innocuous, generic kind of stuff, nothing to set the house on fire. Obviously, none of his full-blown creationist stuff ever gets in the regular journals. But you get to see what he thinks is okay anyway, because he self-publishes through the creationist technical journals, Answers Research Journal and stuff in their old technical journal and the like. And so he's got a very long pile of technical arguments that he's done over the years. However, if you look at how he plays fast and loose with data, as was known earlier when he was kind of faking up stuff on dating of lavas and other things, that the regular geological community basically gag at him. And the idea that, oh yeah, Andrew, you want to come in and gather some samples for your nice scientific research. Yeah, right. We know that you've got an ulterior motive with this thing. And so from his perspective, he's being all sciencey because he's trying to test out his models, which involve disproving regular evolution. And remember, he knows regular geology must be wrong because he knows it must be wrong because the Bible tells him what's true, and therefore he knows what must be wrong. So he's got a gigantic axe to grind. And I know by direct inspection of Snelling's stuff that he's perfectly capable of just walking roughshod over the contents of his papers, of the stuff he cites. So I know that he did that on radiometric dating of diamonds. I know that just recently a thing that was brought up because I was following up on a thing that Jackson Wheat brought up about an old paper that he had done, or an issue that I brought up, and I discovered a Snelling paper, and then Jackson looked at some of the stuff, and it was clear that Snelling was just, it was the laboratory generation of oil, and how different this was from natural oil. And it's all part of the argument that oil really was formed catastrophically and recently, and therefore this was evidence that he was misusing. He was avoiding the content of the paper. So with Snelling, he isn't playing on the same field that he claims to. And naturally, that the creationists get all pushed out of shape over because the fact that he's being denied because of his religion. No, it's denied because he's an axe-grinding geek. And there's no reason why, if you can't explain exactly what the hell you're doing in a rigorous way, that no, you can't just go running around in here because it's a national park and not everybody has rights to do stuff. So that's the way it's going at the moment. I don't know that it's hit adjudication yet on it. I'm sure that whatever the way it turns out, creationists will crow about how fabulous and incredible and wonderful this is. That's how they do everything. They never lose anything, and they never allow themselves not to win. So it's in their apologetics, they're always top dog. They're the Donald Trump of anti-evolution apologetics. Well, we're a little past 6 o'clock here. I think we've pretty well covered the subject matter. Any last minute questions? Hi, Ev says, just noting that since James said it was still an adjudication, and I think that's what he was talking about. Yeah, as far as I know, it hasn't been settled. If it has, it didn't hit my scope. If it has been settled, please let me know on it. But I'm not sure. I seem to think there was, I remember seeing a piece of stuff that was filed, but I don't know whether or not it's reached the stage. I may be confusing it with something else, as whether there's actually been a ruling yet saying, nah, you can't or can't do that. I try to be as fascinating as usual. It was settled in June. Okay, that's probably what I was thinking about on there, that I misremembered it, that actually was the thing where they said, nope, you can't do that. And in which case I probably do have it in the bibliography. But okay, Old Scratch says, sorry, 4.28 billion years old. That sounds much. That's 200 million years, or 20 million years off there. Anyway, I will ask again, anybody who can tell people about the project that you haven't already, look at the material, share it. Please, if they can help at GoFundMe or Patreon, I can use it. Anybody who hasn't had my books, social media, anywhere that you know of, and for heaven's sakes, pester Jerry Coyne to pay attention to Slam Dunk. Anybody in that area I'm very proud of the work. I think it's a significant thing. Christine Janis, in a review, paleontologist, is wowed by it. And I'm hoping that more people can be wowed by it. It can't do a damn bit of good if more people don't read it and use it. So that was my shameless plug for the day. And sorry, Scholar in Spokane has to shut off then. Thank you for all watching.